Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Dr. Andrew Collins stood before a packed auditorium. His crisp white coat a symbol of his mastery in the world of medicine. As the keynote speaker for the annual medical conference, Andrew exuded confidence. His decades-long career as a celebrated cardiac surgeon had earned him respect and admiration. But beneath the polished exterior lay a man who had built his success on calculated decisions, some of which haunted him in fleeting, quiet moments he would never admit aloud. Medicine is about precision and sacrifice, he declared, his voice commanding. But above all, it is about making the hard choices. As the crowd erupted in applause, Andrew's mind wandered briefly to a decision he had made 30 years ago. A decision that still whispered through his subconscious like a ghost refusing to be exorcised. His then-wife, Emma, had been a bright, compassionate woman with dreams of her own. She had been the one to soften his sharp edges, the one to remind him there was life beyond the hospital walls. But when Emma announced her pregnancy, Andrew had seen the news as a roadblock, not a blessing. "You don't understand, Emma," he had said coldly, his words slicing through her like a scalpel. "A child will derail everything we've worked for. My career is at a critical point." Emma's tearful pleas had fallen on deaf ears. He had given her an ultimatum: terminate the pregnancy or leave. To his shock, she chose the latter. Without looking back, she disappeared from his life, taking their unborn child with her. 4 years, Andrew buried the memory. He convinced himself it was for the best. Emma's departure had allowed him to climb the ranks unencumbered, and he became the man standing on this stage today. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, as he lay alone in his sprawling but empty home, he couldn't shake the faint echoes of Emma's voice or the thought of the child he had never met. The hum of applause snapped Andrew back to the present. He descended from the stage, shaking hands and accepting compliments with practiced ease. The evening gala that followed was another exercise in networking and self-congratulation, but Andrew found himself growing restless. He declined an invitation to a private after-party and instead returned to his penthouse suite, pouring himself a glass of scotch as the city lights twinkled below. It was during moments like this that the silence was deafening. He scrolled through his phone, mindlessly checking emails and news updates until a headline caught his attention: Rising star surgeon Dr. Ethan Monroe to speak at National Health Summit. Andrew's brow furrowed. The name was vaguely familiar. Clicking the link, he was met with the face of a young man in his early 30s. His features strikingly sharp yet softened by an air of kindness. Ethan's accolades were impressive: a gifted cardiac surgeon with a groundbreaking new technique for complex heart repairs. Andrew felt a strange pang of envy mixed with admiration. Shaking off the unease, he closed the article and finished his drink. Tomorrow would bring another day, another surgery, another opportunity to solidify his legacy. The next morning, Andrew's alarm buzzed at 5 a.m. His schedule was packed as usual, starting with a high-risk bypass surgery that only someone of his caliber would attempt. He walked into the operating room, the sterile environment comforting in its familiarity. The surgical team greeted him with deference, and Andrew donned his gloves, preparing to save yet another life. Hours later, as the patient was wheeled into recovery, Andrew felt the first twinge of discomfort. A dull ache in his chest radiated to his left arm. He brushed it off, attributing it to stress and fatigue, but the pain grew sharper as the day wore on. By mid-afternoon, he found himself clutching the edge of his desk, his vision blurring. "Dr. Collins, are you okay?" his assistant asked, her voice tinged with panic. "I'm fine," he lied, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. Moments later, Andrew collapsed. When Andrew awoke, he was surrounded by the sterile white walls of an unfamiliar hospital room. Monitors beeped rhythmically beside him, and the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic. A nurse entered, her expression professional yet empathetic. "Dr. Collins, you experienced a severe cardiac event," she explained. "You're lucky you were brought here in time." Andrew's mind raced. He had spent decades saving others from the brink, but now he was the one lying helpless in a hospital bed. The irony was bitter. "Who's handling my case?" he croaked, his throat dry. The nurse hesitated. "Dr. Ethan Monroe. He's one of the best." Andrew's stomach churned. The name from the article flashed in his mind. He was in the hands of a surgeon he had admired from afar just the night before. Little did he know, the connection between them ran far deeper than admiration. The door to the room opened, and Ethan entered, his presence commanding yet unassuming. He glanced at Andrew with a polite smile, his eyes betraying no hint of recognition, at least not yet. "Dr. Collins," Ethan began, reviewing the chart. "You've had a significant cardiac event, but we caught it in time. I'll be performing your surgery tomorrow morning. Don't worry, you're in good hands." Andrew nodded, his pride swallowing the urge to question the younger man's capabilities. But as Ethan adjusted the 4-line and made a note on the chart, something flickered in his eyes. A hesitation, a subtle shift in demeanor that Andrew couldn't place. As Ethan left the room, Andrew's mind whirred. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him, but the fog of pain and medication clouded his thoughts. Unbeknownst to Andrew, Ethan's mind was also racing. The name Andrew Collins was one he had heard only in whispered stories from his mother. Could this man, the patient whose life now lay in his hands, be the father who had abandoned them before he was even born? The night before the surgery, Andrew found himself restless, trapped in the unfamiliar vulnerability of being a patient rather than the all-knowing surgeon. The steady beep of the heart monitor was a metronome for his thoughts, pulling him deeper into a fog of anxiety and confusion. There was something about Ethan Monroe that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Name, face, a connection he couldn't yet articulate. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his office, staring at the patient file. Andrew Collins. The name, once abstract and distant, now carried an almost unbearable weight. His mother's stories echoed in his mind. Stories of a man who had once loved her but discarded her when she needed him most. Ethan had grown up with more questions than answers about his father, a shadowy figure his mother rarely mentioned but whose absence shaped every aspect of their lives. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Dr. Patel, a colleague and friend. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Patel remarked, leaning against the doorframe. "Maybe I have," Ethan replied, his voice heavy. He hesitated, debating whether to share his suspicions. "Have you ever operated on someone who might have wronged you in the past?" Patel raised an eyebrow. "Are you talking about this Collins case?" Ethan nodded. Patel crossed the room, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Whatever this is about, remember your oath. You save lives, no matter who they are." Ethan nodded, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. Tomorrow, he would face not just a patient but a ghost from his past, a man who might not even recognize the child he had abandoned. The morning of the surgery arrived, and the operating room buzzed with quiet efficiency. Andrew was prepped and ready, though the vulnerability of lying on the table was a feeling he couldn't shake. As the anesthesia began to take hold, his last coherent thought was of Ethan's face, still hauntingly familiar. Ethan entered the OR with practiced confidence, but inside, his emotions churned. This was no ordinary patient. As the surgical lights bathed the room in a sterile glow, Ethan took a deep breath and focused on the task at hand. His team worked seamlessly, following Ethan's precise instructions as they navigated the complexities of Andrew's heart condition. Hours passed, and the surgery was nearing its conclusion when one of the nurses murmured, "Dr. Monroe, your precision is incredible. You're as brilliant as Dr. Collins was in his prime." Ethan froze for a fraction of a second, the comment striking a nerve. He quickly recovered, completing the final sutures with steady hands. As he stepped back, the reality of what he had just done hit him. He had saved the life of the man who had chosen his career over his family, the man who had left his mother to fend for herself. "Good work, team," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. When Andrew awoke in recovery, The first face he saw was Ethan's. The younger doctor stood at the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable. "The surgery was a success," Ethan said. "Your heart is strong, and you should make a full recovery." Andrew tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced him back onto the pillow. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice weak but sincere. "You're talented. Reminds me of someone I knew once." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "Rest now, Dr. Collins. We'll talk later." As Ethan left the room, Andrew's mind began piecing together fragments of memory. The way Ethan's eyes narrowed when their gazes met, the subtle hesitations in his voice, and that last name, Monroe. It was familiar in a way that made Andrew's chest tighten, but not from the surgery. It was something deeper, something he hadn't thought about in decades. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the room carrying a folder. His demeanor was calm, but his hands gripped the folder tightly, betraying his inner turmoil. "Dr. Collins," he began, taking a seat beside the bed. "There's something I need to tell you." Andrew looked up, confusion etched across his face. "Is there a complication?" Ethan shook his head. "No, the surgery went perfectly. But this isn't about your heart. It's about your past." Andrew's pulse quickened, though he wasn't sure why. "What are you talking about?" Ethan opened the folder, revealing a photograph. It was old and slightly faded, showing a young woman cradling a baby in her arms. Andrew's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the woman immediately. Emma. Her eyes, filled with warmth and determination, stared back at him, and the baby in her arms had the same striking features that Ethan carried now. "You abandoned her," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You told her to choose between her child and her marriage, and she chose me." Andrew's world tilted. The room seemed to shrink as he struggled to process Ethan's words. "You're my son." Ethan nodded. "And for years I wondered about the kind of man you were. My mother told me enough to know you made your choice. And now here we are." Andrew felt a wave of shame crash over him, threatening to drown him. I didn't think she'd keep the baby," he stammered. "You thought wrong," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "She kept me and she gave me everything she had. She worked double shifts as a nurse to put me through school. She made sure I knew that I was loved, even when you didn't want me." Andrew's eyes welled with tears, but he couldn't find the words to respond. The reality of his choices he had justified for decades, was now staring him in the face in the form of the son he had never known. Ethan stood, his composure remarkable given the weight of the moment. "You're alive today because of her. She's the reason I became a doctor. And she's the reason I was able to save your life." Andrew opened his mouth to speak, but Ethan held up a hand. "Rest, Dr. Collins. We'll talk when you're ready." As Ethan left the room, Andrew was left alone with his thoughts, the beeping of the heart monitor a constant reminder of the second chance he had been given, one he wasn't sure he deserved. Andrew lay in his hospital bed, replaying Ethan's words over and over in his mind. The revelation struck him like a scalpel slicing through layers of pretense he had carefully crafted over the years. He had always believed his decisions were justified, sacrifices made for the greater good of his career. But now, confronted with the truth, he realized that those sacrifices had been nothing more than selfishness in disguise. The face in the faded photograph haunted him. Emma had looked so radiant, so full of life, even under the weight of raising a child on her own. And Ethan, his son, had grown into a man of incredible skill and compassion, qualities Andrew barely recognized in himself anymore. For the first time in decades, Andrew allowed himself to feel the full weight of his choices. He wasn't just a renowned surgeon or a keynote speaker. He was a man who had walked away from his family. And now, the son he abandoned had saved his life. A few days later, Andrew was cleared to walk short distances around the hospital. Ethan had kept his distance, letting another doctor oversee Andrew's recovery. The absence of his son only deepened Andrew's sense of isolation. He wanted to speak to Ethan to explain himself, but what could he possibly say to undo 30 years of neglect? One morning, as Andrew shuffled through the hallway, he caught sight of Ethan in the staff lounge. He was laughing with a group of nurses, his demeanor warm and approachable. Andrew lingered by the doorway, feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't his to witness. "Ethan," he finally called, his voice hesitant. Ethan turned, his smile fading as their eyes met. The room fell silent, the nurses awkwardly excusing themselves. "Dr. Collins," Ethan said formally, his tone devoid of the warmth he had shown his colleagues. "What can I do for you?" Andrew hesitated, feeling the chasm between them. "I was hoping we could talk privately." Ethan glanced at his watch, then nodded. "Follow me." They ended up in a small conference room, the air thick with tension. Ethan leaned against the table, arms crossed, while Andrew sat down, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know where to begin," Andrew admitted. How about with the truth?" Ethan interrupted. "Why did you abandon us?" The bluntness of the question left Andrew reeling. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "I was ambitious, arrogant. I thought I was doing what was best for my career, for my future. I told myself that raising a child would have derailed everything." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And what about my mother? Did her future not matter to you?" Andrew swallowed hard. "Did. But I convinced myself that she would be better off without me." "Better off?" Ethan's voice rose. "She worked herself to the bone to give me a chance at life. She sacrificed everything while you built your career and lived in luxury. Do you even understand what she went through?" Andrew lowered his gaze, the weight of Ethan's words pressing down on him. "I can't change what I did," he said quietly. "But I regret it. I regret all of it." Ethan's expression softened slightly, though the hurt in his eyes remained. "Regret doesn't undo 30 years of absence, Dr. Collins. My mother didn't need your money or your pity. She needed your support. And I needed a father." Andrew's chest tightened, not from his surgery but from the raw emotion coursing through him. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "But I'm asking for a chance to make things right. However I can." Ethan studied him for a long moment, his jaw tense. "I don't know if that's possible," he admitted. "But I'll tell you this. My mother believed in second chances. She believed people could change. Maybe she was right." Andrew nodded, his throat thick with emotion. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." In the weeks that followed, Andrew worked to rebuild his strength, both physically and emotionally. Ethan didn't offer forgiveness outright, but he allowed Andrew to remain in his orbit, sharing brief conversations that hinted at the possibility of reconciliation. Andrew learned more about Emma's life, her struggles and triumphs, and the incredible son she had raised. One evening, Andrew sat in his hospital room, a box of old photographs on his lap. Ethan had brought them, a gesture that felt like a tentative olive branch. As Andrew sifted through the images, he found himself laughing and crying in equal measure. Here was a life he had missed, moments he had forfeited in pursuit of a hollow ambition. Months later, Andrew attended a ceremony at the hospital where Ethan was being honored for his groundbreaking contributions to cardiac surgery. As Ethan took the stage to deliver his speech, Andrew sat in the audience, his heart swelling with pride and regret. "My mother taught me that strength comes from love," Ethan said, his voice steady. "She taught me to fight for what matters, even when the odds are against you. Everything I am, everything I've achieved, is because of her." The audience erupted in applause, but Andrew felt a pang of sadness. Ethan's words were a testament to Emma's unwavering spirit, a spirit he had once dismissed. After the ceremony, Andrew approached Ethan, his hands trembling. "You deserved better," he said simply. "You and your mother both. But I'm proud of the man you've become." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Dr. Collins. I'm proud of the surgeon you were. Maybe one day, I can be proud of the father you're trying to become." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As Andrew walked away, he realized that life had given him a second chance, not to erase the past, but to honor the sacrifices that had shaped his son's future. And for the first time in years, he felt hope. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.